you see my screen, Sean?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So like Sean mentioned, it's Neil. I don't know who all's on the call, so I don't know which ones of you I know and don't know. Obviously connected to a lot of people in the game industry here in the Colorado area. I got started at Backflip, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, back in 2013 as a game designer. Started on the prototyping team. So when we had an internal prototyping team, there was 3 or 4 of us just building games, prototypes for what our next, at the time, micro game product might be. So just building multiple games a week and just rifling through things. Then working as a game designer on things like Rooftops, a little game called Furno, the unforgettable Dragonvale Wings, and a G.I. Joe game. And then I spent the last 2 or so years there as a game designer slash lead UI UX designer on Dragonvale World, obviously the sequel to Dragonvale. And then about 2 years ago, I left Backflip and started a UX design and development studio called UX is Fine with a couple other guys. So what we do at UX is Fine is basically people come to us for a few things. They're looking to build a game and they need some expertise that they don't have in-house in terms of UX and UI design. So we do a lot of design work for people from a holistic UX lens. So we get in and help them figure out, designing their features, so not just UI, but designing their features and, how they can create features that, end up being the product that they want. We obviously do a lot of interactive wireframes, things like that. We do a bunch of analysis and solutions in terms of game teardowns. So people come to us and their game has metrics issues, their game's not hitting their metrics, or it's just not quite fun, or people are confused by a system. So we do a lot of analysis and then help people fix issues with their game. And then we have an art side of our business. So we do a lot of UI art and characters and things like that for various studios. So like I'm sure a lot of you, that have been in the industry over the years, I kept finding this truth in games, the big gap between expectation and reality. And so over the years, just talking more and more with, the people alongside me, and sort of this growing frustration, bewilderment of the sense of, we're just kind of fumbling around in the darks towards some unclear target, and it's, there's studios all over the place. And I've experienced this, not just at Backflip, but working with, tens of studios on all kinds of different games at UX is Fine, all kinds of different genres, all kinds of different sizes. There's a whole lot of this going on. And so it kind of set me on this crusade years and years ago of trying to find a better way, a more sort of intelligent way, if you will, to make games. And it kind of just gave me this question of okay, how do we, which is really what this group is all about. I think this is what we're all here for. It's how do we get better at our craft? How do we get better at, making games? So that kind of led me down, trying to understand the problem more. And it really comes down to a couple key things. And that's, like I mentioned earlier, oftentimes the targets are not very clear. They're very fuzzy. They're sort of held by, that intuitive, ether that floats around the studio where everyone's kind of yeah, we're making this, we know what we're making. But it's very rarely written down or clearly defined in sort of a measurable way, which is obviously tough, right? Because making, games are very complex things, and it's certainly not a perfect math or science. But I've always had this inkling, and it was shared, with me by my coworkers and fellow designers, that we could make making games at least more scientific than it is currently. And that kind of leads, to the second sort of problem is, as game design is so young, I think a lot of designers would tell you this, there's an overwhelming lack of, tools, guides, principles, to aid in what is an incredibly difficult process, right? We all know making games is super hard. And I'm not here to say it's easier. Here's the wham bam way to make a game and make $1 million. But I think we all know that this is kind of one of the things we're chasing is how do we get better at our craft? How do we give ourselves tools, principles that we can, apply to making games, regardless of what the game or the genre is. So yeah, the question I was trying to answer is, how do we create a clear target of the experience we're trying to make that doesn't necessarily hinge on specific features, because targeting a feature set, like I'll talk about in a little ways throughout the talk, targeting a specific feature set without really understanding the experience you're creating for people, a lot of times leads to problems. And so this led me to another question that I started to explore, really just trying to get better at my craft. And that's why do people play games? And so as I started to ask that question, it led me to a lot of things, but one of the most powerful things it led me to was self-determination theory. So I don't know how many of you, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, but it's a really, really, really extensively researched model of basically fundamental human motivation, human needs, outside of, and these are mental and emotional, cognitive, psychological needs, not, survival and things like that. That's had some really valuable past applications to video games, because that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to create an experience that someone of their own volition, they voluntarily engage with this thing, and ideally engage with it, a lot and for a long time. So it really does come down to understanding sort of the science of motivation and what people are looking for. And self-determination theory breaks down like three fundamental needs. The first one is competence. So competence is basically just, it's the need to feel challenged, to feel effective, to have success over those challenges. So this is what, a lot of times when people talk about flow state and they talk about, the sawtooth curve and they talked about optimal challenge, it's presenting the player or, the user with challenges that are right at the edge of their skill set. If they're too easy, they're boring. If they're too hard, people get frustrated. And this is an innate need that people have. They need to feel challenged and they need to be able to experience some success in those challenges. The other sort of nuanced part of competence is that sense of not only am I overcoming challenges, but I'm growing and I'm learning. So I'm getting better. So in games, obviously we talk about this a lot when we talk about things like mastery and mechanics and features that satisfy those needs. Autonomy, this one's it's fairly obvious, but it's really, it's how we talk about player agency and freedom. It's about players having the sort of ability to make the choices that they want, which is not always the same as player freedom, right? You could have a game where you have all kinds of freedom to do, but if what you want, but if it's not the thing that you're really, trying to do or how you immerse yourself in the world, then it can fall flat, right? And the important thing about this is autonomy is present in a lot of, strategic elements of games. It results in those feelings of responsibility and ownership, right? Because I have the power to sort of, choose my path, then I feel that extra oomph of pride and sort of ownership over what I was able to do in the game. And games in and of themselves, in a meta sense, are autonomous in that, our players volunteer to play these things, right? So they're very, they're, the word that commonly gets used is autotelic, which is basically, self-chosen. And so then the last one is relatedness. And this is just the fact that we're all social creatures, and people have an innate need to sort of feel connected to others, that I matter to you and you matter to me. So obviously, this comes from a lot of social features and things like that, things that connect people or make people feel connected in some way in a game. So I did a lot of research on this, and it was really useful and has really powerful applications to games. But it was still too broad to be useful, like in designing a specific game or a specific intended experience, because those three pillars really can summarize, just about any game out there. And so I needed something more specific. And so I started to look for, okay, how do you get teams or yourself able to articulate, the intended experience without just throwing out, oh, it's like this game, it's like that game, or referencing other features. And so the way this model or sort of this method started, and has evolved since then, is it started, where we would use 3 to 5 sort of player-centric statements that describe what the game felt like in key moments. And so it gave a bit more of a potent sense of, regardless of features or the nuances of feature implementation, what is the game supposed to feel like? Because that's really what people are coming there for. They're not coming there for your inventory system or your combat system. They're coming there for the way that makes them feel. And this, got more and more useful, and it was better than nothing. But the big problem was it was very hard to use on games going forward. So game development in the early stages, this was something that we were only ever really able to apply on games that were completed, right? You could look at a game and you could really, really understand and describe what it felt like to play. But when I would try to ask people, or even ask myself on my own game projects, how is the game supposed to feel in these key moments? What are you supposed to feel like? The problem we kept coming across was just this problem of a blank slate. People didn't have anything. They didn't feel like they had a starting ground, and so people would just kind of gloss over, and they're not really sure, and they don't know how to answer the question. And then immediately they just start grabbing for reference games and things like that. And we're really trying to aim at the experience, sort of agnostic of specific features or reference. We want more detail than that, because as we'll talk about here in a minute, you can implement a strikingly similar feature set or a nearly identical feature from another game in your game, and it can completely not work, right? And that's why we're sort of questing after something that is a little bit more down in the guts of why people play, rather than just, okay, we have a trade market system, right? And that means it's going to work the same as other trade market systems in other games. So like I said, needed a better place to start, so people didn't feel overwhelmed by the question. So that is where I did some more research, and I came across, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with this, or certainly with Quantic Foundry, the Quantic Foundry gamer motivation model, right? So Quantic Foundry has surveyed, almost 500,000 gamers, and distilled a bunch of that data using, scientific methods and all that stuff. And they've come up with this set of sort of core gamer motivations. So you've got like the core ones across the top line, and then these sort of sub motivations below them. So I did a bunch of digging into this, but it was still really a bit too high level, and there was some omissions and things that sort of didn't really capture all the types of experiences that we felt were out there, to really be totally useful in when you're trying to develop a very specific intended experience. So that's where we started. We started from the Quantic Foundry gamer motivation model, and we sort of used that as the base, and then we started to build upon it, using our experience and what we felt was needed to sort of get to that level of specificity and useful detail, to provide a model that would help guide developments and productions forward from the very beginning. So like I mentioned before, this is still this is our latest iteration. It's still a work in progress. We're still evolving it, but this is the base model that we've built, and you'll see a ton of similarities between it. It has these very similar high-level motivations, as the gamer motivation model does. It adds some things that we felt were missing from that model, like the concept of, for example, like the gamer motivation model only goes down to the level of challenge, right? But if we want to really accurately understand, an experience, well, there's two really big buckets, of challenge, right? And that's input challenge, so first-person shooters and stuff like that, and then there's thoughtful challenge, right? Tactics games, things like that. And so we added some things, we refined some things, but really the big thing we did was really just starting to paint this stuff in more useful detail so that we could start to work with clients on it. So this document is like a big interactive map. And what you'll see is, so like if you go down in one of the motivations, we've got like a description at the top. So it talks about the experience, of creativity and like what that feels like in a game. And then it breaks down, the sort of sub experiences. So exploration, and it talks about in sort of a narrative and sort of player centric way, experience centric way. So the experience of wondering what is possible and exploring an unknown space to discover new, unexpected things, right? Because a lot of times what I've seen happen in the past is, people will say, oh, this game is about exploration. But then they have things like quests all over the game that tell you where to go, right? So it might be a big open world full of things you can, quote unquote, explore, but if the experience is so guided by missions, it becomes, a game of go here, do this, which really fights against any sense of exploration, right? So that's why we get down to this level of detail, because it's very dangerous and happens all too often where people are like, they just throw out buzzwords and they're like, it's about exploration, right? But without understanding what exploration really feels like and what it means in more detail, that can be sort of a misleading path. So then if you click into one of these things, we've got all these things measured on a spectrum, right? So this is like the overview of an experience, right? So we've got the low end of the spectrum, so where you sort of call out some keys of what that looks like, right? Smallest possibility space, linear path of experience, limited control over systems, clear, explicit, extrinsic goals. And then on the high end of the spectrum, in terms of like high exploration satisfaction, that sense of, being able to explore environments, what's out there, exploring systems. So not just environments, but systems, if I combine these three things, what happens? Will this work? Markers, of like emerging gameplay, events, genuine surprise and novelty, and, more focus on intrinsic player generated goals. So that's sort of the overview that we provide. And then we've got examples, across a spectrum of games of what low exploration looks like and what high exploration looks like. And so we use this with clients, first before we get into the project specific applications. We use this to familiarize them, with this model, and establish a shared language and a shared understanding so we can all sort of talk at the same level. And then one of the last things we do is, we call out the emotions, the experiences, so curiosity about, what's around the corner, wonder and excitement, about sort of that possibility, the unknown, like that pride, when your theory of like, oh, I wonder if this works, like leads to a genuine discovery. And what you'll notice here is actually this kind of loosely, it's not perfect by any means, but it kind of loosely breaks down around self-determination theory in terms of, over in, creativity, exploration, and self-expression are obviously largely about, choosing my path, exploring of, sort of creating my own goals. That sense of chaos is a lot about, being able to see my impact on the environment, to cause, disruption or destruction or things like that. And that sense of tension a lot of times comes from, a sense of a threat, but my agency and control over dealing with it, right? And along the top, obviously, we have things that are, very sort of, that give that sense of competence, right? When you're increasing in power, your character's increasing in the power in the game, getting better items, leveling up, getting better gear, increasing your stats. Obviously, it's not you that's getting more powerful, but games give that sense. They get the sense that you're getting better, you're overcoming challenges. The same with completion, even just checking off, simple tasks, doing quests, it satisfies that sense to some degree of competence. And then obviously, the whole mastery category, challenge, strategy, risk, very much fits into that. And then on the right, relatedness. So obviously your social features, but even in story and role play, even if you're not necessarily relating to other people, being immersed in the story and feeling like that character and feeling like you are connected to the world and you do matter to something larger than you. So that's the sort of base model that we use, and we familiarize people with it. So then the question obviously becomes, okay, cool, but how do we use this thing? How do we actually apply it? And so yeah, I just want to, before we get into like the application, I want to touch on just sort of narratively some of the problems we're trying to solve, right? So we're trying to overcome things like this, right? Greenlighting games with visions that are too high level to really be targeted. I call this the peanut butter and jelly paradox. I'm sure other people have as well, but I've watched games get greenlit and millions of dollars be spent based on someone saying it's this plus that, and that just doesn't really give you clear, measurable design goals and targets. And it leads to iteration, like just in all types of directions instead of forward. And that's not to say you can always have a perfectly clear vision, but with a clearer vision, you can iterate in a direction that, even though it varies a little bit, you can be a little bit more confident that it's at least getting you closer. It's forward progress towards a vision that maybe isn't perfectly clear, but gets you a little bit closer. And then this is one of the ones I see a lot, and I'm sure we've all seen a lot, and that's just implementing features without understanding sort of the experience and their purpose. And this manifests itself, in a lot of ways and cascades to cause other problems. And I touched on it earlier, but it doesn't really lead to, it doesn't give you any aids to understand like why something isn't working when it's not. And people end up in this situation of like, well, we have that feature, but why isn't it working like it works in other games? Like, why aren't people engaging with it? Why aren't we getting the results? And I've seen that a lot. People just cherry picking features and then being so surprised. And the reason is because when you don't understand sort of the true experience, you don't understand the drastic difference from the nuances of implementation and the other interconnected systems that can happen. And the other thing is, features and functionality are really not a useful success criteria. Do we have this feature? Do we have this functionality in our game? And using that as your only success criteria, that level of detail, and not going lower to a lower level of detail, is not really going to provide you with measurable goals that give you, confidence of your success. Because just because you have a chat feature in your game and a trade market does not make your game social. It does not mean that it's satisfying people in a way that truly the experience of community and competition do. And then, yeah, the last bit is just kind of a summary that the same sort of seeming features can provide really different experiences, and also on the flip side, very different features can provide the same experience. And that's why it's important, and we focus on getting down to the layer of experience and not mechanics and things like that. The other one is, and you see this a lot in studios, and we also see it a lot, even more so as an external team, not being in the studio. And that's the problem of unspoken assumptions. There's like a really dangerous amount of sort of head nodding that goes on, where people think they're on the same page, but then they realize they're not, and it leads to a lot of trial and error and wasted time. And the other thing is, the simple truth of one of the things I've discovered over my career is that, like, forcing yourself to write it down, so forcing yourself to clearly articulate the vision or whatever the goals are, it immediately puts to the test your understanding and starts to improve it. Because what people don't realize is that that vision that's floating around in the ether of a studio, that seems so clear to everyone, because we're all tied to the same game project, oftentimes really isn't that clear. And when you gets down to the brass tacks of trying to write it down, a lot of times people can't. And then the last one is the other problem, that we're trying to alleviate, that we see is the concept of, design principles or pillars that are way too high level to be useful, and even to the degree where they can be misleading. And my favorite example of this is, one word pillars. I've worked with people that have, worked on games, big blockbuster games that have ended up being successful, but with pillars like combat, navigation, puzzles, social. Those are so vague they can't really be targeted. You can say, okay, this feature has combat, or yes, there's combat in this mission, or we just made 2 combat missions, let's make a puzzle mission. But it doesn't really aid your design in creating an experience. And so that gets into our goals, what we're trying to do with clients using this model. And one of the big ones is just having a shared language that we can, a codified language that we can all use, so we know we're on the same page, we're talking about the same system, to give us sort of measurable targets, more measurable targets to sort of to guide our game design work. And a better measuring stick for feature success. Not do we have this feature? That's a very easy, sort of not great measuring stick. But did we create the intended experience? And then the other thing is, games and intended experience and UX and things like that are very hard to measure. But that's one of our key goals here, is establishing a framework, for feedback. So, giving us, as we have this model that calls out all the details of an experience, we start to have signals to look for, questions we can ask, when we do user testing, emotions, feelings, experience, we can start to test for and be a little bit more concrete in measuring, did this feature hit the mark? And then the last one is, which we'll talk about towards the end, is, mapping a game's features to product goals, via the intended experience, but also looking at our user groups and the priority of those features and things like that. So one of the first things we do with people is, we show them the model. They click through it, they can explore it, and then we just have a conversation with them. We talk about what's the game they're trying to make, and then we have them go through the model and basically, in a prioritized fashion, pick out, okay, well, what are the core 2 to 4 most integral experiences to the overall experience, and we have them sort of assign points to those in terms of, how integral is this thing, and so the higher importance is, that the cost of not getting that part right, so the cost of not getting the strategy element right, is more detrimental than the cost of not getting the exploration right, or if it's not quite up to snuff where we want it, right? So this is kind of where we start with people, walking them through the model, and it's kind of a workshop exercise to get them, within this framework, to start to be able to understand and articulate their vision, such that we can measure against it. So then what we do is we go through each of those sort of core elements of the experience. And again, it's not every element of the experience, because there's trailing, pieces where, this little feature over here has some things that aren't, the essence of the game. And we do get into those things. But first, we tackle those experiences that the team has identified really are the identity and the essence of what the game is supposed to feel like. And then we have them chart that on the spectrum, right? So there's measuring, okay, how important is exploration to the overall experience? But then there's, okay, well, what level of exploration are we trying to satisfy? Because low is not always bad and high is not always good. It's about identifying and understanding, where you really want to be, right? So we have them, chart this. And then we do the same thing with the examples slide. So we chart where this is supposed to be. We use reference examples that they give us to help understand, so we wouldn't necessarily use these same generic examples from the model. We may if they apply, but if they have, other examples of, like, it's like this, It's not like this. This is too high, this is too low. So we work with them to create some more project specific examples, including examples of the mechanics and features and things that we think are going to create this experience for this product itself. And then we do the same thing with the emotion slide. So we would be going through and creating, emotional and sort of experiential centric statements about, the emotions and feelings that they expect their game to generate. And these might be, also in the context of specific game moments. So players feel this like overwhelming triumph when they beat another player in a match or whatever, things like that. I hear you. No worries. Um, then what we do is, if we're already coming in, the game's already playable, and people are hiring us to help them understand why it's missing the mark, or when we get to that point, we have something that's implemented. Then we start to put together the sort of actual set of slides, the deltas, and that's where we call out this was the target, and then based on our experience, based on playing it, based on what we're seeing with user testing, this is where we think we actually are, and we start to call out sort of the key bits of the delta and what's there and what's not. We use some highlighting to indicate well, these parts about the target worked, but these parts aren't present. And we do that with all of these sort of layers of detail, even down to the emotions, right? So we have sort of a codified language for like, players are feeling this, we're feeling this when we're playing, we're not feeling these things, and these are actually, these exclamation points, these are actually some surprise things that we didn't intend that are actually occurring. That may or may not be good. We'll have to analyze that with the team. So that's sort of our baseline of working with the team within the model to create a clearer vision of, these are the core parts of the experience, the different sort of experiences that make up the overall. This is where we want to measure on the spectrum. And then let's use that to understand when we're hitting our creative goals and we're not, and give us a better understanding of what is the true delta from the experience side. How are we missing it and why? And so then the next layer that we work through with people, and this kind of all happens all at the same time, but is starting to paint our users and our types of users, different user behavior profiles, painting those in more detail. Because most games, some games kind of have one user sort of user profile in terms of what motivates people. And how they behave. Most games, especially in sort of the modern like free-to-play era where games just have huge feature sets, a lot of times we've got multiple different user types, and they're motivated by different types of experiences, and we need to understand that. We need to understand it in a detailed sense. So not using things like demographics and things, this game's for 21 to 25-year-old males, that also play shooters. Well, within that, age range, there's potentially a ton of different types of people that are motivated by different parts of your game in different ways. And so we want to capture with people, how do we intelligently target those people and make sure that we're, understanding what all our different user types are, and, also taking care of them and providing them features and offerings for them. So this, again, is something we're continuing to evolve through each iteration that we do it with a client. But this is actually based on some work that we did with Fortnite for Epic last year. We're working on a sort of competitive feature revamp. And so this isn't necessarily representative of all the user types inside of Fortnite, but it was sort of a smaller scope in terms of focused on the competitive vector of the game, the competitive sort of feature set. And so we've got these profiles that describe players, so non-competitive, players don't currently play arena, they avoid high stakes, they like improving their skills, but in a safe environment. And then we really try and understand these people from sort of a behavior and an emotional standpoint in terms of, what behaviors describe these people? What are they doing in the game? What are they not doing in the game? Why? How do they feel about certain things? So we come up with a bunch of those statements to help us understand this user like from that perspective. So we break this out, for each user, type that we identify. And so obviously you'll kind of notice this doesn't necessarily incorporate the model as much. And that's one of the things we're working on right now is, advancing, sort of our methods and our use of this where, we start to map, okay, of each, types of the experience in the game, each parts of the experience, where is this user type, looking for that to be at, right? So obviously the elite player, these are the ninjas, the boogas, the streamers, they want that competition turned up to the max, right? That's what really satisfies them. And then you start to talk about, the competitive person. So this is kind of your average, high schooler type of person who, cares about how well they do in the game and they really want to do well and they get frustrated when they don't do well. But they're not looking, to compete at that, that elite level is intimidating to them, right? And then you talk about the non-competitive player that's kind of just here to play for fun. They still want to challenge and they still want to compete, but they don't want to be up at that level. They don't want to be crushed. Competing and beating other people is not that important to them, right? They're not. They're looking for other parts of the game, right? So they're not going to be interested in systems that are ranking my performance every game and putting me in a bracket and things like that, because that's not what is satisfying about the game for them. And so then obviously we would score these different user groups along the different parts of the experience, and you start to see some interesting things emerge, where non-competitive players don't necessarily want a strong sense of competition, but they do want to be challenged. They want that input challenge, but not quite to the degree maybe of an elite player. Of course, one of these slides is disconnected. One second. Dude, I can't use anything other than XD at this point. I sure as hell can't use Google Slides. So we've got the intended experience lens, which we sort of covered first, right? So that's the experience we're trying to create. Then we start to cross that with our user groups, right? So our different user profiles, because again, not all users are looking for the same experience. So we're creating one game, but a lot of times it has to house and motivate different user types, right? So we have our intended experience, then we sort of cross multiply that in a matrix against understanding our user groups and okay, well, pieces of the experience are motivating for them. And then sort of the third piece of the trifecta is really, and it's really what it all comes down to, because whether we like it or not, all commercial games come down to money, right? It all comes. I mean, we all want to make games, but we need to make money to keep doing that, right? So that's where we bring in the business goals aspect, and also incorporating our different user profiles with them. So what we do is we really focus with clients on a few things, creating very measurable, explicit business goals. So this is an example of the sort of feature goals for this competitive play revamp that we were doing. And obviously, if we were talking about a whole game, you would have game level goals, and then we would also have feature level goals. And these are easier, despite sometimes it being like pulling teeth. These are definitely easier to get specific about because it does come down to business. It does come down to metrics. It's not as fuzzy as creative goals. So we work with people to write these down, to write them down in a prioritized fashion, in a very measurable fashion, so we can understand, the experience aspect is giving us more measurable targets for our creative goals. So did we hit the creative goal of this feature in terms of did we create the intended experience? And this side of it gives us, okay, did this feature hit its business goals, right? Because then we can really understand the gaps. We can understand, okay, did we miss the creative goal and we didn't actually create the intended experience with the game or with the features? And is that why the game's not performing? Or did we actually think we nailed the creative experience and somehow we were misguided in our business goals, that creative vision was not going to deliver these business goals, or we set them incorrectly? And this, again, it falls into the category of oftentimes people are resistant to trying to write this stuff down, because there's that sense that it's, well, yeah, everyone knows, like, it's supposed to be this, like, and there's that, it floats around in the quote unquote intuitive ether of the studio. But again, this is a really good exercise that we go through with people. And you would not believe how many times people think they're on the same page, and then when we work with them to force ourselves to write it down, time and time again, people realize that they're not on the same page about what the actual goals of a feature are, or the sort of business goals of the game, or they're not on the same page about the priority of those goals, what's more important than the other, because everything can't be number one. And then the other important part that we really focus on with people, and you'll notice this in this slide, is incorporating the user groups, right? So incorporating, like, okay, well, we're trying to increase monetization in elite and competitive players, but nowhere in there do you see increasing monetization for non-competitive players. And that's a really important nuance to understand, because otherwise, what you can do, and what we ended up frankly doing for a little while, is agonizing over, oh my gosh, how are we going to sell this thing to how are we going to make this appealing to non-competitive players? And then we went through and did this, and we're like, it was a big design relief, and we could stop wasting design time, because we realized it's not really the goal to sell this, this competitive pass to elite or competitive, or to non-competitive players, because they're never going to buy it. That's not what they're looking for. What we're trying to do for them is get them feeling like they have an offering for them where they can dabble in arena or tournaments, and gives them sort of a sense that they have a chance to compete in a more compelling way to play. So yeah, those are kind of the three vectors of it. There's the intended experience and making that measurable through the model. There's working through and painting our user groups in a behavioral and emotional sense, not just demographics, so we can really understand, how we can create experiences that motivate them. And then there's the bringing the business goals into it. And so yeah, the whole thing is aimed at aligning the business and creative goals of a game, of a product, so you have a clearer vision that's written down, concrete, and it's shared between the whole team. And that's not to say it doesn't change and it doesn't evolve. And that's not to say that it, makes game making a perfect science. Not by any means. If that was the case, I would be a millionaire. So it's really just about, again, kind of what I touched on in the beginning. How do we get at least a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better at what we do? How do we get, a little bit more scientific? And, games are incredibly iterative, and they always will be. And that's what's beautiful about making games. But how do we iterate a little bit more intelligently, and save ourselves a little bit more time and money and headache? So yeah, that's it. Or booze.
Booze as in like a drink booze?
No, booze isn't like boo bad.
Oh, no, no booze. No, that was great. Thank you. It's interesting too. It's how you apply some of these methodologies to multiplayer and the retention of both kind of the more casual games and the more gamers and the more competitive gamers. So that's really interesting insight.
Yeah. 1 second. Yeah, so I mean, it really comes down to things like this. So it really comes down to, it really comes down to things like this, and understanding, okay, we've got this model that we think, and I would encourage you guys, because we've done a bunch with it, but we're continuing to do more. We've got a model that we think is high enough level that it's not too specific, that we're not defining every single type of experience like very specifically, but it is detailed enough that we feel that if you combine the various parts of the model, exploration, creativity, all those things, you can take those, and we feel we have enough pieces currently until we realize we're wrong, which we inevitably will be, and we'll evolve the model. But currently, we feel like we've got enough descriptive experiences that if you combine them, you can describe and measure just about any game out there. And so it's about painting each of these, spectrums in detail, understanding the ends, and then understanding the middle points with, some contextual examples of games and things like that. And then down here, like, this product name where it's just bullet point, bullet point, bullet point. That's where we have, the client, we work with them to add in, okay, what are these specific sort of key signal metrics that we're going to look for that we think are going to create this experience at this level, at this intensity. And then, things like this, where, we're creating statements about what players are going to feel and experience. And then, whether it's internal testing through dev, or whether it's user testing, we're quite literally turning these into, questions and signal metrics for users about, okay, well, are people experiencing this, right? Because if we said that this was all going to come together and create this type of experience, then we can measure for it and say, well, is it or is it not? And like, what are the pieces that are missing? And it gives us much better ground to put our feet on to start understanding, okay, well, why is it not working? I don't know if that answers the question at all, Sean. Yeah, and I think Sean just hit on something really key, like to reinforce, and that's, these need to be written, like everything needs to be written as a measurable success criteria, such that it's sort of a binary pass fail filter where you can, so whether or not you're using a model like this, even if you're using something like even just remotely similar to it, like just jotting down some statements like these need to be things you can hold up to your game and clearly say, is this happening or is this not happening? Are users experiencing this or are they not experiencing this? Because then you can make decisions based on that. If you don't have that, well, then you're just fumbling around. And if you have things like, we talked about in the beginning, like, oh, social, you can't hold up the word social to your game and measure anything.
Yeah, I like the methodologies here because they're like they seem a little bit more granular, and like you said, they set up sort of a goalpost and a measurement by which you can kind of gauge this experience. Whereas, like you said, the social, we want social. How many times have I heard that? It's like it's so vague. I think it's great.
Yeah, that one's my favorite. That one's my favorite. There was a time where I was working on a game where there was a slide that was presented, and it was like our game, and then it was like all the top 10 successful games at the time, and it was literally a grid of check boxes, and it was like our game is going to have like this feature from this game and this feature from this game, and it was a slew of green check marks of all these features we were going to have. But again, it was feature centric, and it was, oh, we're going to have chat, and we're going to have a trade market, and our game's going to be social, without understanding what those things actually meant and the nuances of how and why they worked, which is why that, as you can imagine, did not go so well.
Yeah, and it rarely ever does. I mean, it's I can't tell you how many times I've been in those kinds of meetings where they're like, "We're gonna do these things that this other game does," and then you're like, "I don't know how that's gonna happen," and sure enough, it doesn't.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I'm not, and I hope it doesn't come across like I think I have the answers. Like making games is hard. It's hard as shit. It's very hard for me. It's not about me thinking that like we've got some model that like boils it all down. It's really just comes from like it really comes from a quest of, man, I love, I mean, to get like real honest for a moment, like I love making games so much that I desperately want to find ways to be better at it and to get better at it. And so that's really where this comes from. Um, so yeah, that was my disclaimer of hopefully I don't sound like a messiah preaching from the pulpit who thinks he has all the answers. Because I don't. Yep. Place. They Yeah, and those statements 100% have their place. They even have their place in conversations among designers and developers. It's just that you can't stop there. And I see people stop there and then try to build a game based on it's peanut butter plus jelly, and inevitably it's peanut butter and sauerkraut at the end. And it doesn't work out. So I agree with you that those types of statements are 100% useful. It's like an elevator pitch, right? An elevator pitch is very useful for a game, but you sure as hell should not greenlight a production or try to design or develop a game just with an elevator pitch, right? So it's all additive layers of understanding, right? This doesn't necessarily like replace anything. It's really just like, how do we add levels of detail to our understanding of our creative vision, um, such that we can target it and we can measure it a little bit more accurately. And don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of subjectivity in here. This is not like well, it's a 6 and this is exactly a 7. But I think it gets us a little bit closer to what a lot of us, at least in that are game designers on the call, like are questing after. Yeah, careful what you wish for.